Hey guys, welcome back to Step Closer. This is the final story in the book, which is called Coming Home. And I'm really excited to get to this one because apparently it's even sadder than Step Closer. Which, if you remember the first story, Step Closer, it was very sad. The ending mostly, at least in my opinion. So I'm not looking forward to this, and yet I am looking forward to this at the same time. Also, the main character, this is, like, I guess, kind of a spoiler, but not really, because it's on the back of the book and everything. But, I mean, I guess it could be considered a spoiler. The main character's name is Susie, who is one of the missing children, and who is the one who went on to possess Chica. So, I don't know if this is gonna, like, have to do with that, but that's what everyone's kind of theorizing, is this is probably gonna have to do with Chica. Again, I don't know for sure, so it's not really a spoiler, it's just my guess, but I could be right, and in that case it's a spoiler. I'm going to get to reading now, because it's already been a minute, and I haven't even started. So, let's start Coming Home. Susie listened to gravel crackling under the tires of her family's old minivan, as her mom maneuvered it past Oliver, the big oak tree in front of their house. Susie was the one who named it Oliver. Her sister, Samantha, thought naming a tree was stupid. Her parents said it wasn't usually done, but that didn't mean she couldn't do it, so she did. Oliver was really, really big. Susie's dad said Oliver was older than their house, and that was really old. Susie's mom's great-great-great-grandma had been born in this house over 150 years ago, and Oliver was already there. As soon as we get the groceries put away, Susie's mom said, I'll start dinner. She spoke very slowly, with weird spaces between some of her words. Susie thought it sounded like someone was trying to stop her mom from talking, and her mom was working really hard to talk anyway. Susie thought of voices as colors. Her mom's used to be bright orange. Now it was dull brown. It had been this new color for a long time. Susie missed the old color. Does spaghetti sound okay? Susie's mom asked in the same disturbing voice. Susie didn't respond to the question because she didn't care about dinner, and she knew Samantha would care. Samantha cared about everything. She liked to be the boss. I think we should have those curlicue noodles instead, Samantha said. Susie smirked. See? Samantha's voice had changed too. It had never been bright. Her voice used to be kind of a pale blue, but now it was gray. Susie turned and pressed her nose against the minivan's side window so she could see Oliver more clearly. She frowned. Oliver looked sad, even more so than he usually did at this time of the year. Scattered in a ragged wreath around the base of his thick, knobby trunk, pale yellow and dull red leaves filtered over his exposed roots in the afternoon breeze. More than half of Oliver's branches were bare, including the thick branch that suspended Susie's tire swing. The rest of the branches held leaves the same color as those lying on the ground. Oliver always lost all his leaves in the fall. 3 years before, when Susie was 4 and Samantha was 3, Susie got very upset about the leaves falling from the oak tree. She told her mom that the tree was crying, and if the tree was crying, it was feeling bad, and if it was feeling, it needed a name. That's when she named him Oliver. Samantha, though a year younger, said naming a tree was frivolous. Frivolous was a word she learned from Jeannie, their grandmother. Samantha liked learning words. She liked learning, period. She didn't like frivolous things the way Susie did. Susie's mom explained that Oliver wasn't crying when he lost his leaves. He was preparing himself for the winter. He had to let go of the leaves so he could keep his trunk fed through the cold months. Then, after the cold months, he'd grow new leaves. He has to let go before he can regrow, she said. We all have to do that sometimes. Susie sort of understood this, but she still thought Oliver was sad. The only thing that made her feel okay about the falling leaves were their beautiful colors. Normally, Oliver's falling leaves were golden yellow and bright red. As Susie's mom pulled the minivan around the side of the house, Susie turned to look back at Oliver. His leaves looked different this year, duller and drier. Susie wondered if it had something to do with the elves that lived in his trunk. She grinned. She knew Oliver didn't have elves in his trunk, but she was just being silly. But she once told Samantha he did, just to bug her. As soon as the minivan stopped at the stairs to the left of the wraparound porch, Samantha unbuckled her seatbelt and threw open the door. Samantha was always in a hurry. Susie's mom didn't move even after she turned off the engine. She did this a lot, Susie had noticed. Her mom would kind of get stuck. like she was a wind-up toy that didn't get wound up enough. She'd just stop in the middle of doing something and stare off into the distance. It scared Susie because she wasn't sure if her mom was still there. It looked like she was, but it felt like she'd left her body behind. A sort of bookmark to hold her place while her thoughts took the rest of her someplace else. The car engine ticked a few times before going silent. Susie smelled the onions in one of the shopping bags in the back of the minivan. She smelled something else, too. No, not smelled. It wasn't her nose that told her something was in the air. It was... what? Her other senses? What senses? Jeannie once told Susie that she was special. That Susie had an ability most others didn't have. She was plugged in, Jeannie said. Susie had no idea what that meant, but she liked the sound of it. Jeannie said it was one of the reasons why Susie felt things other people didn't feel. Right now, Susie felt like something was wrong. That something was like a smell. Like the smell of something rotting? Going stale? Susie wasn't sure. Susie wanted to say something to get her mom moving again, but then she noticed Samantha was standing next to the minivan, looking through Susie's window. Samantha had that look on her face, the one she wore often lately. Susie didn't understand the look. It was part angry, part sad, and part scared. Susie's mom finally moved. Sighing, she shook her head and pulled the keys from the ignition. She picked up her purse and opened the door. "We need to get these groceries inside. It could rain." Susie glanced through the windshield toward the low-hanging gray clouds behind the steep green roof of the old house. The clouds were heavy and dark. The big house had a lot of space, so Susie and Samantha each had their own room. Susie, though, liked hanging out in Samantha's room. She thought Samantha would rather she didn't, but even though Samantha liked to boss people around, she wasn't mean. She and Susie both liked people to be happy. So, because Susie liked playing in Samantha's room, Samantha let her. Samantha wasn't as good at sharing things, though. Like toys, she insisted she and Susie play with their own toys. Susie always wished she and Samantha could do things together, not just side by side. When Susie got her cool baking set for Christmas a couple years back, the one with all the fun plastic foods and the pots and the pans and the hot pink apron, she wanted to play restaurant with Samantha. But Samantha wouldn't do it. She insisted on playing instead with her own construction kit. Even if they were both playing with dolls, Samantha wanted to keep her dolls apart. Like right now. Susie sat on the thick blue rug that lay on the floor next to Samantha's big bed. The rug matched the crisp curtains at the window that looked out at Oliver. Susie glanced at him. He looked like he'd dropped a few more leaves. His remaining ones hung limply in the muted gray evening light. In front of her, Susie's dolls were arranged on blocks set up in a semicircle. It was a choir, and she was going to direct them, but first she had to be sure they were all in their right spots. She moved the dolls around, deciding who would sing what part of the song, humming while she did it. She didn't normally hum, but her mother did. She hadn't heard her mother hum in a long time. On the opposite side of the rug, Samantha had her own dolls perched in front of the boxes. The boxes were working stations, Samantha said. Susie wasn't sure if the dolls were in school or at a job. Either way, it was pretty clear Samantha's dolls weren't going to have as much fun as Susie's. Did Samantha see that too? Maybe that was why she kept looking over at Susie's dolls and blocks. Susie crossed her legs and looked around. Samantha's room was so organized, with light blue canvas bins stacked up neatly on white shelves. A big white desk with a super bright metal desk lamp, the big bed with its simple metal frame and its perfectly made blue and white checked bedspread, the two tidy white nightstands with their small blue lamps, and the window seat covered with its simple thin blue cushion. Susie's room, which she could just see through a connecting door, was filled with color and chaos. She had a window seat, too, thick and tufted and covered in purple velour. It was piled with flowery pillows. Her purple shelves had no bins. Susie hated bins. She liked to see her toys and books and plush animals because they made her feel happy. They all hung out in the open on the shelves, like they were having a big party. Samantha looked over at Susie's dolls again. She pressed her lips together so tightly it made the skin around her mouth pucker. The expression made her look like an angry dog. Susie looked wild and mischievous, and Samantha looked like a good girl. Susie's brown eyes were usually wide open, while Samantha's were often squinting, so Susie looked eager and Samantha looked cautious. Susie had a smaller nose and mouth and was usually called cute. Samantha had their dad's larger nose and mouth, and Susie once heard her grandma say about Samantha, "She'll grow into her looks and turn into a handsome woman." Samantha glanced around at Susie's dolls before rearranging her own dolls to stand at their stations. Poor things. When Samantha was done with her dolls, they'd have to go back in their bins. "Do your dolls want to be in my choir?" Susie asked. Samantha didn't answer. Susie sniffed. She wrinkled her nose. The air smelled like spaghetti sauce and garlic bread. It also still had that other smell, the one she didn't understand. Well, fine, she didn't need Samantha's dolls to have a good choir. Making one final adjustment, Susie picked up a ruler and tapped it on the block she had set up in front of her dolls. Then she began waving the ruler back and forth the way she'd seen directors do it. Before Susie got through 3 waves, Samantha suddenly stood up and kicked Susie's dolls off their blocks. Then she kicked the blocks, too. All the dolls and blocks tumbled over the fluffy rug and clattered onto the dark wood floor beyond. Susie winced. Now she'd have to set up a hospital with her blocks and heal the dolls. Samantha glared at Susie before running out of the room. Susie thought about yelling after her, but fighting with Samantha never accomplished anything. She learned it was better to be quiet and let things blow over. Even so, Susie's mom appeared in the doorway. Tall and skinny with dark brown hair, Susie's mom used to look like she could be a model. Susie remembered when her mom's hair was really shiny and bouncy, when her mom's big eyes were always made up with long fake lashes and her wide mouth was always painted with sassy red lipstick. Now her mom wore no makeup and she looked tired. Dressed in faded jeans and a wrinkled blue t-shirt, Susie's mom gazed at the toys on the rug. Susie got up and walked over to her. "Mom?" Her mom kept staring at the toys. "Are you okay?" Tears filled her mom's eyes, and Susie felt like someone was squeezing her heart. "I feel like something is wrong," she told her mom. "Something bad has happened, but I don't know what it is." Susie really wanted to tell her mom that everything was okay, but her mom just covered her mouth with her hand and let the tears spill from her eyes. Susie knew her mom wouldn't answer now. She never liked talking when she cried, and weren't the tears an answer anyway? Normally after dinner, her mom would go to the 3rd floor and work. She had a big studio up there because she was a textiles artist, making big modern quilts and woven blankets that people never use on their beds. Her mom's blankets were hung on walls, which Susie thought was weird, but her mom liked making them, and according to her mom, the pretty blankets paid the bills. Which was a good thing because Dad wasn't here anymore. Susie didn't understand why he left, but he was gone. Was that the bad thing? Susie wrapped her arms around her knees. No, she didn't think so. She thought it was something else. She wondered if she should try to hug her mom. Probably not. Her mom didn't like to be hugged when she cried. Susie just stood there, hoping her mom would stop so they could talk. But her mom didn't stop crying. She just pushed away from the doorknob and walked down the silent hallway. Samantha was outside, wandering around the front yard and blowing bubbles. Anyone watching her would think she was having fun, but Susie knew Samantha didn't blow bubbles for fun. She did it to study air currents. Susie knew better than to ask if she could blow bubbles too. Samantha would say no, it would mess up her research. But Susie wanted to be near her sister, so she wandered to Oliver, patted him on his rough, moist trunk, and ducked inside the faded black tire swing. Pushing off from the ground, she got the swing going, then she threw her head back to look up at the gloomy sky as the swing spun in a lazy circle. The evening air was cold, but not too cold, and it had that fall scent that Susie had heard others describe as crisp. She didn't know what crisp smelled like. She thought fall air was a two-sided smell, tart and musky at the same time. And of course, the fall air around her house still had that other smell that she didn't like. Susie closed her eyes and refreshed her spin. She could hear Samantha trotting around the yard. Oliver's dry leaves crackled under her feet. Then Susie heard voices. She opened her eyes and turned so she could see the sidewalk. Long ago, their house was a farmhouse that sat in the middle of lots of land. But as the years went by and all those great-grandmas grew from little girls to old women, the family had to sell part of the land. So said Susie's mom. Eventually, Susie's grandma had sold the last of the land to someone called a developer. And the developer built a big subdivision that surrounded the house. The new houses were built to look a little like the old farmhouse. Susie's mom said they were Victorian, but the new houses didn't have the personality of the old houses. The new ones were all in serious colors like gray and tan and cream. Susie's house had lots of fun colors. Mainly it was yellow, but the trim, and there was a lot of trim, was purple, blue, pink, gray, orange, and white. Susie's mom called the trim gingerbread, which made no sense to Susie because the trim wasn't made of cookies, although she wished it was. Susie always thought it looked like her house was dressed up to go out, and the other houses wore everyday work clothes all the time. The sidewalk in front of the new house was wide, and it was closer to their house than Susie's mom wanted it to be. Susie didn't mind that. She liked watching people go by, especially from the tire swing. A big laurel hedge along the front of their yard blocked the view of Oliver's lower trunk and the tire swing. Susie liked to stay there and play spy, watching people through the hedge without them knowing she was there. The group going by now had 5 kids in it. She was pretty sure they were in Samantha's class. 3 of the kids, all girls, were walking bikes. A 4th kid, a tall boy, was messing around on a skateboard, and the final one, a smaller boy, was on a scooter. It didn't look like he knew exactly how to use it. "Hurry up, Drew," one of the girls snapped at the small boy. He was blond, and his hair stuck up all over on his head. "Yeah," another one of the girls called. Both girls had dark hair, and they wore jeans and blue hoodies. "This place is spooky." Susie slowed the tire swing and listened to the kids. Spooky? Did they sense it too? That thing that Susie didn't understand? "Hey, Professor," the 3rd girl called out. This girl had reddish hair, and her black leather jacket hung open to show a light pink shirt underneath. Susie knew Professor was Samantha. Even if the word hadn't been said in a sarcastic tone, Susie knew it was supposed to be an insult. Ever since Samantha started grade school, her classmates had made fun of her for being so serious. Susie hated that the kids did that, and the first time it had happened, she tried to stick up for Samantha. "What's wrong with being smart?" she yelled at the kids. "You're just jealous that she knows more than you." Susie had thought Samantha would appreciate this support, but Samantha got upset. "I don't need you to take care of me," she told Susie. "I have to stand on my own 2 feet." Susie knew Samantha had gotten this expression from the grandma, but she didn't argue, and she never again tried to stop the kids from their teasing. So she didn't speak up when one of the girls called out, "Freak!" "Come on, Drew," the boy on the skateboard said to the boy with the scooter. "I hate passing this house," the leather jacket girl said. "Yeah," one of the other girls agreed, shivering. The 3rd girl said, "I used to play with them when I was in kindergarten. She was always serious." She pointed at Samantha. "But she at least would talk to you. Now it's like she's..." She shrugged. "I don't know." The kids had passed the house, but Susie turned to watch them, and she kept listening. "You can't really blame her," the small boy said. "Come on, Drew," the leather jacket girl said. "Let's just get by, huh?" When night came, it dropped on the house like someone up in heaven abruptly threw a black blanket over everything. The girls got ready for bed as usual, and as usual, Samantha didn't protest when Susie got into her bed. She knew Susie hated to sleep alone. Even so, Samantha always slept with her back to Susie, and she always slept as far from Susie as possible, especially now. Susie faced the window. Even though the window had a shade, it was never pulled. Susie's mom said the house should have as much light as possible, sunlight or moonlight. Susie liked to lie awake and look at the way the moonlight brought things to life in the room. The eerie glow cast shadows over Samantha's bins, making them look like big mouths trying to gobble the moon. She also liked to look at the stars and name them. Tonight, the stars were hiding, and only the faintest gleam from the moon's silver managed to pull through the clouds. The only light coming into the room reached dimly from the porch lights over the front and back doors. The room was cold, and the cold bothered Samantha more than it did Susie. So the girls lay under 2 thick, soft blankets. Susie shoved the blankets away from her mouth. "Are you awake?" Susie asked her sister. She kept her voice at a whisper. Samantha didn't answer. This wasn't unusual. She didn't like talking at night. But that didn't stop Susie. "I keep having this bad feeling like something's wrong," Susie whispered. She didn't wait for a response. "The world smells funny," she told her sister. She twisted up her mouth, trying to describe the smell. "It reminds me a little of when we leave leftovers in a container too long, and then Mom tells us to clean them out and we have to hold our nose and talk like this." She held her nose and talked in the funny voice that resulted. She giggled to herself. Samantha remained quiet. She never thought Susie's funny voices were all that funny, and maybe she was actually asleep. Susie held still so Samantha's smooth blue sheets wouldn't make that shushing sound they made when you shifted in the bed. She focused on Samantha's breathing. It was deep and even. Susie pulled her legs up tighter and nestled her head further into her pillow. And Oliver's leaves aren't the right color. They're not bright enough. Samantha breathed in and out. And Mom's acting strange, you know? Samantha did not respond. Susie sighed. She closed her eyes and tried to go to sleep. Thump. Susie's eyes shot open. Had she fallen asleep? Did she dream that muffled sound she just heard? She lay perfectly still, listening. Thump. 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 No, she didn't dream it. Someone or something was walking around on the porch. The sound was of a big foot hitting the wooden boards. Susie sat up, clutching the smooth sheets and Samantha's soft white blankets. She cocked her head to listen closely. That's when she heard the taps between the thumps. Thump. Tap. Thump. Tap. Thump. Susie didn't move, but suddenly Samantha sat up. She immediately swung her legs over the side of the bed, but she didn't stand. She just sat there, her back rigid. You heard it too, Susie whispered. Samantha didn't reply, so Susie decided she had to do something on her own. She made herself let go of the covers, then dropped her legs out of bed. She ignored the cold air that hit her ankles, and she padded out of the room and down the stairs to the kitchen. Susie paused by the island and looked at the pale yellow glimmer creeping through the kitchen window. It radiated from the porch, light above the back door. The digital clock up over the stove glowed red in the darkened room. 11:50. The refrigerator hummed, the faucet dripped. It had dripped for quite some time, Susie knew. 1 drip every 10 seconds. She waited through 2 drips while she listened to continuous thump-tap sequence outside on the porch. When the sounds faded enough to make her think that whatever was making the sound was on the opposite side of the house, she went back to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it. Just then Samantha reached over Susie's shoulder and slammed the door. Susie whirled toward her sister. Samantha's eyes were huge. Her lips were compressed, and for the first time since she said goodnight to their mom, Samantha spoke. There's nothing out there. Go back to bed. She turned and marched out of the kitchen, making it abundantly clear that Susie was supposed to follow her. Jeannie's voice was so warm and strong that even though it came through the phone line, it sounded like she was in the room. You're more than Susie's mom, Patricia, she said. Patricia held the phone to her ear with one hand while she brushed her limp hair with the other. She sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, the bed that was far too big for her alone. But it had been far too small for her and her husband. That's why he had to leave, so they could stop intruding on each other's space, although why they needed all that space was never clear to her. And more than Samantha's mom, Jeannie continued, you're you, and you'll find yourself again, eventually. Patricia sighed. Samantha won't talk to me, except to order me around. Jeannie laughed. She's her own woman. Patricia wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at that. The idea of her 8-year-old daughter acting like a woman was amusing, but the idea that her daughter had been forced to turn into a pint-sized woman was not amusing at all. It'll get better, Jeannie said. It always does. Patricia nodded, even though Jeannie couldn't see her. Jeannie would know she'd nodded. Patricia and Jeannie had been friends since they were Samantha's age. Together they'd gone through school, college, and grad school, both in art. When Patricia married Hayden, Jeannie was to be the maid of honor, and when Patricia had her girls, Jeannie became their godmother. Jeannie was like the sister Patricia never had. I don't know if I'm doing this right, Patricia said. There is no right, Jeannie said. That made everything harder somehow. I wish... She stopped and froze. What did she just hear? Did that come from outside or inside? You there? Jeannie asked. Patricia stayed silent, listening. Patricia? Patricia shook her head. She was imagining things. She blew out air. I'm here. Susie had followed her sister back to bed, but now she was creeping away. This time she paused for a second outside her mother's room. She was probably on the phone with Jeannie. They talked pretty much every day, either in person or over the phone. If Jeannie was in town, she'd come by, but she traveled a lot for her job. Her job was buying art for people. Susie thought that sounded like a very fun job. Susie lurked in the hallway, hoping to hear her mom laugh, but a laugh never came. Instead, the footsteps sounded again. Thud. Tap. Thud. Tap. Susie put her shoulders back and turned toward the top of the stairs. Descending slowly, pausing on each step, Susie looked over the top of the waxed oak banister to the paned window at the front of the house. Sheer curtains blurred the outline of the porch rails, and beyond them, Oliver's solid presence. He stood like a tireless guard in the middle of the front yard, but the sheer curtains couldn't block the shape that Susie saw stalking past the windows on the front porch. The shape was too big to hide. All the curtains could do was distort it and disguise what it was. The shape moved slowly, deliberately, lurching in sync with the sound of its step. Thud, tap, thud, tap. As it moved, its head swiveled. Susie could see the reflection of sharp eyes as they searched the interior of the house. Every time those eyes looked her way, Susie turned into stone, willing herself to disappear into the background. Even though she wanted to hide, Susie didn't go back to bed. She couldn't. She knew that. So she continued down the stairs, managing one step for every 6 footsteps she heard on the front porch. By the time she reached the first floor, the shape was passing on the last of the tall windows on the left side of the house. Susie tiptoed ahead of it. Ducking into what used to be her dad's office, she watched the shape outside pass the office window and head toward the kitchen side of the house. Hesitating only a moment in the empty room lined with dusty shelves, Susie pushed off the door jamb and went into the kitchen for the second time that night. She crouched behind the island as the shape passed through the yellow light outside the kitchen window. Once it had moved on, heading back toward the front of the house, Susie stood. She clenched her fists, then released them, and she went to the front door. The front door was as old as the house. Built of thick wood and stained so many times the door always wanted to stick when you tried to open it. The carved front door reminded Susie that time couldn't be stopped, no matter how much she wanted it to. The footsteps paused. Susie listened. She heard nothing at all. She reached for the front doorknob, and she opened the door. She opened the door in increments, 2 inches, 6 inches, a foot. She took a deep breath, stepped around the door, and looked up. She waited, like she always did, every night. Frightening, familiar, persistent. Susie didn't cringe or tremble or jump back, even though it would have been reasonable for her to do any one of those things. Instead, she said, "Is it time to go back already?" Chica held out her yellow hand. Her mouth didn't move. Susie knew Chica wouldn't answer because Chica didn't talk to her. Susie turned away from the man-sized animatronic chick standing in front of her. She looked back up the stairs, longing. But longing didn't do any good. Susie looked back to the animatronic chick. Ignoring the gaping metal mouth with all the teeth, Susie focused on Chica's bright yellow body and the big white bib hanging around Chica's neck. The one that said, "Let's eat." Then she looked at the cupcake Chica held. Susie thought the cupcake was just scarier than Chica. It had eyes and 2 buck teeth, and 1 candle stood up straight from the middle of it. Susie didn't know what the candle was for. 1 day? 1 year? 1 child? Letting Chica take her hand, Susie walked away from her house. Every step made her feel less like herself. By the time she passed Oliver's still falling leaves, she was lost. Patricia stared through the open front door at the oak tree that was dropping its leaves all over the front lawn. She had a feeling she'd just missed something important. Several minutes before, she heard the sound again. This time she couldn't talk herself out of it. She left her bedroom and come into the hallway. When she looked down the stairs, the front door was standing wide open. Heart racing, she'd run to Samantha's room and peered in. 1 glance slowed her heart rate. Okay. Her worst nightmare wasn't playing out. But why was the door open? Grabbing a pair of knitting needles and holding them in front of her like a knife, she crept through the house, checking for an intruder. There was nothing. Patricia closed the door and turned the deadbolt, and pressed her hands against the door, pushing with all her strength as if she could shove away the reality, maybe press it into some other form. Pulling her hands back abruptly, sucked in her breath, there was something she hadn't considered. What if someone had come through the still open door while she searched the house? She turned and ran up the stairs to Samantha's room. She nearly collapsed in relief. Everything was okay. Samantha was awake. She sat up in bed, the covers pulled up to her neck, her fists clenched and her knuckles stark white. Tears made her eyes sparkle in the faint light from her bedside lamp. Patricia sat down next to her daughter. She wanted to pull Samantha into a tight hug, a never-let-you-go hug. But Samantha wouldn't like that. All she tolerated was the slightest touch. So Patricia briefly placed her hand on Samantha's shoulder before she said, "I know you miss her. I miss her too." Samantha blinked. and 2 tears escaped her eyes, meandering down her lean cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Patricia sat next to Samantha for a long time, but neither mother nor daughter spoke. Finally, Patricia stood, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and returned to her huge bed. Samantha waited for her mother to leave before she moved. She lay on her back, watching the light and shadow play cat and mouse on her ceiling. If Susie was here, she'd make up some story about the shadows and light, about them fighting each other or dancing or something. She was always making up things. Susie got that from their dad. Even though their mom was the artist and their dad was the one who went to work in a suit and tie and did stuff for business that neither Samantha nor Susie understood, he was the one who loved stories. In his free time, he was always either reading a book or watching a movie. He could make up good stories, too. When he was home, the girls had always had an original story at bedtime. Their mom wouldn't even try to make up a story. "I'll read you a story instead," she would say when their dad was out of town. Now she didn't say instead, she just asked what book she was reading tonight. One of the stories their dad made up was about a little boy who had a secret place in a hidden room in his house. From that room, he was able to solve all his problems, no matter what they were. He told hundreds of these stories, making up a new problem for the boy to solve each time. Susie was convinced these stories meant there was a secret room in their house. She was always asking their dad about it. His answer was always the same. He'd pretend to zip his lips shut and throw away an invisible key. Susie said she thought the way to the secret room was in their dad's office at the back of the house. Samantha thought it was just a story, and she was glad the office was always locked so Susie couldn't talk her into getting in trouble looking for the secret room. Now the office wasn't locked because their dad was gone, but Susie no longer talked about looking for a secret room. Samantha pressed her lips together, disgusted with herself for thinking about Susie and the stupid secret room. Then she thought about the sounds she heard at night. She tried to convince herself she imagined them. That had to be true, because when she looked outside, she never saw anything at all. But lying here alone in the silence, in the strange halfway land of the night, she couldn't quite convince herself that she had made it all up. She was pretty sure something had been outside. But what? And why? In the brisk late morning air, Patricia and Jeannie sat side by side in the porch swing, padded with yellow floral cushions. Patricia was aware that to any passerby, she and Jeannie were part of an idyllic scene. Both women wearing wide-brimmed straw hats to shade their faces from the sun that slanted onto the porch, sipped tea to ward off the fall chill. They probably looked as relaxed as could be. They weren't. Or, at least, Patricia wasn't. Patricia studied her friend. Jeannie was almost her perfect opposite in size and coloring. Whereas Patricia was tall and thin with dark hair, Jeannie was short and plump with blonde hair. In spite of these differences, both women used to have one quality in common. They both smiled and laughed easily. Now, Patricia couldn't do that anymore. She took a shaky breath. "I'm wondering if I should take Samantha to a different counselor." She cringed at the way her voice seemed to scar the air. Rhonda is nice, and Samantha likes her, I think. Honestly, it's hard to tell. She waved away a fly. "But I talked to Rhonda last week, and she says Samantha's stuck. Samantha is clearly keeping something to herself, but nothing Rhonda is doing will get her to talk." "Samantha has always done things in her own way," Jeannie pointed out. She grinned. "That child has an opinion about everything." Patricia attempted a smile, but only got about halfway there. "Remember how she always harassed Susie relentlessly about naming that tree?" Jeannie gestured at the ancient oak. "What's his name?" "Oliver." Patricia started crying. Jeannie set down her tea and took Patricia's hand. "I'm sorry. That was insensitive." Patricia wiped her eyes and shook her head. "It's been a year. I should—" "There aren't any shoulds when it comes to losing a child. Isn't that what your counselor told you?" Patricia nodded. No rulebook. They sipped tea in silence for several minutes. Patricia watched Oliver drop another dozen leaves. The previous night's persistent breeze had taken hundreds of Oliver's remaining leaves. He didn't have many left on his gnarled branches. Pretty soon he'd need his scarf. Jeannie patted Patricia's knee. "You're thinking about Oliver's scarf?" It made Patricia literally ache to think about how 4-year-old Susie had run inside after Oliver had dropped his last leaf that first year she named him. When she'd returned, she held out one of the neck scarves Jeannie had knitted for him. Patricia glanced at Oliver and felt like she could see the scene from 3 years before unfolding in front of her now. The scene was a little fuzzy in places, but otherwise it was almost real. Her little arms crossed, her brow furrowed. Susie said, "He'll get cold because he doesn't have leaves." She was dressed in her bright orange jacket. When Susie found out the scarf wasn't big enough for Oliver, she was heartbroken. Until Patricia suggested Susie ask her grandmother to knit a scarf specifically for Oliver. Now, Jeannie knitted a new scarf for Oliver every year. "I've already knitted it," Jeannie whispered. Tears spilled down Patricia's cheeks. She was surprised she still had tears to cry. She was always anthropomorphizing, Patricia said. "I never saw a problem with it." There wasn't a problem with it. She was an empathetic child with a vivid imagination, which is why she was so easily lured. Patricia didn't recognize her own voice. Normally soft, it was now as hard and rough as Oliver's bark. "I should have discouraged her flights of fancy. I should have... Stop it." Jeannie shifted to face Patricia. "Not all the murdered children were like Susie. You don't know that it would have been different if she'd been a different kind of child. You can't keep trying to find reasons to blame yourself." Patricia looked down. "I hated that place," she whispered. "It always seemed creepy to me, but Susie loved it." Jeannie frowned. "Are you sure you want to go over this again?" "I need to..." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do. I can't just forget." "Why not? How are you helping Susie by torturing yourself with the details over and over?" Patricia wanted to yell at Jeannie to shut up, but she didn't have the energy. Jeannie took both of Patricia's hands. "Your daughter was murdered by a serial killer. She was lured to her death in a place where she should have been safe. There. We've dug it up again. Feel better?" Patricia yanked her hands back and started to stand. Jeannie grabbed her arm and held her in place, her grip pinching Patricia's skin. "Don't run away," Jeannie shouted. Then she lowered her voice, but kept it firm, just shy of scolding. "You cannot dredge up the past and then run from it. If you insist on trotting it out to torture yourself regularly, at least you should do it head on. If you don't, you'll be running away your whole life, and you'll never be able to let Susie go." A car zipped by on the road, its engine revving. The smell of exhaust wafted up to the porch. Something about the odor erased Patricia's anger. She was wearing her favorite sweater, the one you knitted for her. "Magenta with pink stripes," Jeannie said. "She wanted sequins," Patricia said, "and you wouldn't let me put any on the sweater. So you put rhinestones on her jeans instead." Jeannie laughed. "You were really angry with me." Patricia wiped her eyes. "Stupid thing to be angry about." Jeannie gently squeezed Patricia's arm, then let her go. A breeze curled up onto the porch from the yard, and Patricia shivered. Susie watched Samantha lean on a rake and scowl at Oliver. "It's not his fault," Susie said. "He can't help it that the leaves land on the ground when he lets them go." Samantha sighed. Susie tried not to be annoyed. "I said I'd do it," she reminded Samantha. Right after they'd gotten home that afternoon, their mom said, "Maybe you could do a little raking before dinner." Susie had said, "I'll do it," but before Susie could get to the rake, Samantha grabbed it, and now she wouldn't let go. And not like doing it, then let someone else do it wrong. Fine, let Samantha rake. Susie would hang out with Oliver. Listening to the rasp and scuff of the rake, Susie went around to the backside of his trunk, away from the road, and hugged him. Oliver smelled smoky and moist. Laying the side of her face against his trunk, she listened. Sometimes, when she listened really hard, she was sure she could hear him breathing. "Hi, Samantha." The greeting came from the sidewalk. Susie peered around Oliver to see who was calling out to her sister. It was Drew, the kid with the scooter and the blonde spiky hair. Today he was alone. Holding onto his scooter, Drew looked across the yard. Samantha stared back at him as if he was a bull about to charge her. Drew waved. "I see you at school a lot, and I just thought I'd say hi. I'm Drew." Samantha glanced around like she suspected a trap. Susie wanted to go to her side and encourage her to talk to the kid, but Samantha would hate that. So Susie stayed hidden and watched. Drew scratched his nose, and his scooter fell over. He bent to pick it up. "Hi," Samantha said. Drew straightened and grinned. Samantha held the rake like a weapon. Susie didn't think that looked very friendly. "Go over to him," Susie hissed to her sister. Samantha ignored her. Susie knew listening to someone else's conversation was rude, according to her mother. So she ran over to the side yard and started talking to the bedraggled plants in the flower beds. Would they tell her why her mom was ignoring them? Samantha wished the boy would go away. She also hoped he would stay. He was cute. But was he being nice or just messing around with her? Drew stepped closer, so he was right at the edge of the sidewalk. I was really sorry about what happened to your sister. Samantha looked down, but she managed to mumble, "Thank you." She took a tentative step toward the sidewalk. Drew looked at Samantha, then he looked up at the house. He lowered his voice. "Do you ever see her?" Samantha went still. She felt the blood rush from her face, and she gripped the rake so hard it hurt. Drew dropped his scooter and took several steps into the yard. Then he opened his mouth, and words tumbled out so fast they piled up on each other. "I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to make fun. Really, it's just that I believe in ghosts, and I think people who die can stay around if they want. I had an uncle who died, and I saw him the night he died, and he came back for a couple of years after that. He was waiting for my dad to forgive him or something. I think ghosts hang around if they want something, you know? So I was just asking. I didn't mean to upset you." "Dinner's ready in 5, Samantha's mom called out from the porch. She didn't notice Drew. Samantha had no idea what to say, so she just said, "Okay," then turned around to head inside. "Bye," Drew called. Samantha couldn't go to sleep because she kept thinking about Drew, about what he'd said. Thinking about Drew was kind of nice. Thinking about what he said was not. His words bounced around in her head. Ghosts hang around if they want something. A faint snick and swish sound came from downstairs. Samantha sat up. She knew exactly what that sound was. Should she go down or wait? The tremors that always started at the sound began at her feet and scrambled up her legs. Ignoring them, she jumped out of bed and padded across the room and into the hall. No sound came from her mom's room, nothing from downstairs either, but was that a cold draft? Samantha clenched her jaw and forced herself down the stairs. At the bottom, she paused, then tiptoed through the dining room and peered into the kitchen. As she knew it would be, the back door was standing wide open, and now she could hear the other noise coming from the porch. Thud, tap, thud, tap. Moaning, she pushed through her terror. She ran through the kitchen, and she slammed and locked the back door. Then she sprinted as fast as she could back up to her bed. Once there, she tried to convince herself she was making everything up. In all the months she had been seeing her, Rhonda had never put back to the Samantha before. Was this some kind of test? Samantha frowned and tried to figure out what was going on. She looked around the room. It was plain and neat, the kind of room Samantha liked. All it had in it was a thick tan rug, Rhonda's listening chair, a cream-colored plush chair with a low back and fat arms, a tan and cream-striped sofa, and a child-sized wood table next to a trunk filled with toys. The room was interesting to Samantha because it extended out from the house like a box, hovering about 2 feet off the ground. 3 of the box's sides were glass. A long sigh from Rhonda made Samantha blink, and Rhonda finally swiveled back to face her. "I'm sorry," Rhonda said. "I've been trying to figure something out." The crinkle between her thick black brows was unusual. Rhonda didn't frown. Mostly she smiled too much, in Samantha's opinion. It wasn't normal, especially for someone who listened to other people's problems all day. "I like figuring things out," Samantha said. "I know you do." Rhonda brushed back her long black hair. Samantha stared at Rhonda's big brown eyes. "So, what are you trying to figure out?" she asked. "I'm trying to figure out how to keep your mom from sending you to someone else." Samantha jerked her head up. "Why does my mom want to send me someplace else?" "Because you're not making progress with me." "What does that mean?" Rhonda leaned forward. "Samantha, I know something is stuck in your head. A thought, a belief. Something you keep thinking is trapped there in your brain and you're not letting it out." Rhonda was right, but Samantha didn't tell her that. Samantha stared at her neatly tied navy blue sneakers. She liked things to be in their right places. She didn't like messy. Change was messy. Therapy was messy too. Before she'd started seeing Rhonda, her mom had taken her to 2 other people who were there to help her. Both had wanted her to play with a messy pile of toys in a messy room. She'd begged her mom not to make her go back. Finally, her mom brought her here. She didn't love it here, but she didn't hate it either. Rhonda was different. This room was different. Samantha was okay with them both. "We had a fight," she said. She had to tell Rhonda what was stuck so her mom wouldn't make her go someplace else. "You and Susie?" Samantha nodded. "Okay." Rhonda scribbled on her notepad. That used to bug Samantha, the scribbling, but she'd gotten used to it. "It was about Gretchen." "Who's Gretchen?" "The doll my mom said we had to share." "Whose doll was it?" "Mom gave it to both of us together." Samantha rolled her eyes. "I hated that. I want mine to be mine. I don't take Susie's stuff, so I should have my own stuff. Okay, but Mom said we had to share. Rhonda nodded. So I tried to explain to Susie that we should each get Gretchen for a certain time. When Gretchen was with me, she'd study. Rhonda smiled and nodded again. Susie got upset about that. She said Gretchen didn't like to study. Gretchen liked to go to the zoo. She wanted Gretchen to hang out with her stuffed animals all the time. She said if Gretchen had to study, she'd be sad. Samantha stopped and remembered Susie standing in her room, hands on her hips, her lower lip jutted out. When Samantha insisted that Gretchen needed to study, Susie threw a tantrum. She cried, "But she'll hate that." So what happened? Rhonda asked. Samantha swung her legs. When I tried to put Gretchen in front of a book, Susie grabbed her and ran off. She what? Samantha counted her breaths, the way Rhonda taught her. It was supposed to help with the feeling that bugs were crawling up her legs. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the fourth exhale, Samantha said, "She ran away and hid Gretchen. Then she came back and told me what she'd done. I told her I'd find Gretchen, and Susie was upset again. That night, she told me she was going to find a better hiding place for Gretchen, and I'd never find her now." Samantha fisted her hands and held them in front of her face. Then she said, "I think she was thinking about where to hide Gretchen, and that's why she got taken. She thought whoever took her would help her hide the stupid doll." Rhonda took a deep breath. "Thank you for telling me. Am I not stuck anymore?" "I don't think you are." Samantha nodded once. "Good. Where is the doll now?" Rhonda asked. "I haven't found it." Susie thought Samantha was unusually talkative today. She hadn't shut up since their mom had picked her up from the funny glass house Samantha visited 3 times a week. Even though Samantha was talking about boring stuff, about multiplying and dividing fives, their mom seemed to be okay with listening. She kept nodding as she drove through traffic. She didn't smile, though. Neither did Samantha. Samantha was so stiff she looked like a robot. She sounded like a robot, too. It was weird. She was talking as if she had to talk, or something bad would happen. If she had to talk, couldn't she talk about something good? "How about we talk about cute things?" Susie asked. Samantha and her mom must not have heard her, because Samantha kept talking about numbers and math. Susie sighed. What was the point in hanging out with them if they were just going to ignore her? Susie turned and looked at Samantha's right ear. Samantha's ears weren't pierced like Susie's were. Susie liked to wear pretty colored things. Samantha refused to have hers pierced because she didn't want holes in her ears. Susie wondered, if I blow hard enough, can I push all the boring words out of her head? Turning, Susie blew as hard as she could into Samantha's ear. Samantha stopped talking. "Ha!" Susie grinned. "Were you done with your story?" Susie's mom asked Samantha. Samantha didn't answer. She sat perfectly still in her seat. Susie wasn't sure the silence was any better than the non-stop chatter. It wasn't a soft, comfortable silence, like a cushy plush bear. It was a sharp silence, like the pointy ends of metal things poking at your skin. The silence hurt her ears, and her heart. Susie started singing to drown out the silence. No one sang with her, but she didn't care. She sang until Susie's mom turned on to their road. Then Susie stopped and waited eagerly to spot her house and check on Oliver. Susie's mom paused to wait for a car to pass before turning into their driveway. The car's blinker did its click-tick until Susie's mom made the turn. Susie mimicked the noise. No one told her to stop. Oliver had lost a lot more leaves. He only had a few left. Would they last long enough? Alright, that's it for now. I think I'm going to turn this into a 3-parter, because it's a bit of a longer story, and we have to read the teaser at the end, too. So it seems like Susie is a ghost, because no one is acknowledging her, and we know she does die, and just everyone is completely ignoring her, except for Samantha, who is like... I can't tell. Is Samantha imagining that Susie's still alive, or is she still alive, and only Samantha can see her? Because Susie's definitely dead, and yet where Susie's still here, she's just barely being acknowledged. So, I don't know. Either way, it's very sad. Definitely, wow, yeah, it's awful, just terrible. But I really like this story. I can't wait to continue it. Anyway, thank you guys for listening. I'll see you guys next time. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I always forget to ask that. I really am curious what you guys think. But in the meantime, Once again, thank you for listening. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.